The fastest way to embarrass yourself at a wedding is to accuse the wrong man of being the groom. Charlotte Hayes had no idea she was about to do exactly that. The late afternoon sun bathed the Napa Valley vineyard in golden light as guests filled the rows of white chairs overlooking acres of rolling vines. Soft music drifted through the air, servers moved quietly between tables, and everything looked perfect. At least from the outside. Charlotte adjusted the pale blue bridesmaid dress she could barely afford and checked her phone for the 5th time in 2 minutes. The florist was late, the photographer was asking questions, and the bride was 10 minutes away from a panic attack. As the maid of honor and unofficial problem solver, Charlotte was carrying the weight of the entire event on her shoulders. She hurried across the lawn when something caught her eye. Near the edge of the property, standing completely alone beneath a large oak tree, was a man in a black tuxedo. His tie was slightly loose, his hands tucked into his pockets, and instead of joining the celebration, he seemed determined to avoid it. Charlotte stopped. Her stomach tightened. Every wedding planner's nightmare flashed through her mind. A nervous groom. A last-minute escape. A disaster waiting to happen. She marched toward him before she could think twice. The man glanced up as she approached. He was tall, calm, and annoyingly composed. Dark hair. Sharp jawline. The kind of face that belonged on a magazine cover. But Charlotte wasn't interested in appearances. Not today. There you are, she said sharply. Everyone's looking for you. The man blinked. Excuse me? The ceremony starts in less than 20 minutes, she continued. You can't just disappear right before your own wedding. A faint smile touched his lips. My wedding? Don't play innocent. Charlotte folded her arms. If you're having second thoughts, now isn't the time. There's a bride in there who deserves better than a groom hiding under a tree. Instead of looking offended, the man seemed amused. That only irritated her more. You're enjoying this? She asked. A little, he admitted. Charlotte stared in disbelief. Unbelievable. The man opened his mouth as if to explain, but at that exact moment one of the coordinators called Charlotte's name from across the lawn. She sighed heavily. Listen, whatever your issue is, figure it out fast. People spent a fortune on this wedding. The stranger's eyes sparkled with a hint of curiosity. Is that so? Yes, it is. Charlotte turned and walked away without waiting for an answer. Behind her, the man watched quietly as the wind carried laughter across the vineyard. A few minutes later, Charlotte was helping guests find their seats when the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and lifted a microphone. Before we begin, he announced with a smile, the family would like to thank the man whose generosity made this entire wedding possible. Charlotte barely looked up. Then she heard a name. And her world seemed to stop. Charlotte felt every muscle in her body lock as the master of ceremonies smiled toward the front row. Mason Whitmore, he announced warmly. Thank you for your extraordinary generosity. This beautiful day would not have been possible without you. Applause erupted across the vineyard. Charlotte slowly turned toward the stage, her pulse pounding in her ears. The man she had just scolded beneath the oak tree stood up calmly from his seat. Guests smiled. Some even rose to their feet. The bride wiped away a tear as Mason acknowledged the crowd with a modest nod. Charlotte could only stare. The elegant venue. The endless rows of flowers. The string quartet. The gourmet dinner. The luxury shuttle service bringing guests from downtown Napa. Suddenly every detail she had admired carried a different meaning. Mason had paid for all of it. Heat rushed into her cheeks. She replayed every word she had thrown at him. Every accusation. Every assumption. And somehow the memory felt worse each time it repeated in her mind. The ceremony began moments later, but Charlotte barely heard a single vowel. Her attention kept drifting toward Mason. While everyone celebrated around him, he seemed oddly detached from the attention. He was polite. Friendly. Yet there was a distance in his eyes that made him appear completely different from the arrogant millionaire she would have expected. After the ceremony, guests gathered on the terrace overlooking the vineyards. Golden sunlight stretched across the hills as waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks through the crowd. Charlotte spent nearly 30 minutes convincing herself to apologize. Every attempt ended with her turning around and walking the other direction. Finally, she spotted Mason standing alone near a stone railing, watching the sunset. Taking a deep breath, she approached him. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. Mason glanced at her and smiled. "For which part?" Charlotte groaned. "Please do not make this harder than it already is." His smile widened slightly. "I am listening." She folded her arms, mostly to stop her hands from shaking. "I assumed you were someone else. Then I decided I knew exactly who you were. Turns out I was wrong twice." Mason studied her for a moment before looking back toward the vineyards. "Most people do that." "Judge you?" she asked. "Judge the version of me they create in their heads." Something about the way he said it surprised her. There was no bitterness in his voice. Just honesty. For a few seconds they stood in comfortable silence. Then the bride suddenly rushed over and wrapped Mason in a grateful hug. "You saved our wedding," she said emotionally. "I will never forget what you did for us." Charlotte watched the exchange closely. There was genuine affection there. No cameras. No publicity. No performance. As the bride hurried away again, Charlotte found herself looking at Mason differently. For the first time all day, she was not seeing a billionaire. She was seeing a man. And for reasons she could not explain, that realization felt far more dangerous than her original mistake. The wedding ended long after sunset, but Charlotte carried the memory of that conversation home with her. By the time she reached her small apartment on the outskirts of Napa, the magic of the vineyard had been replaced by reality. The building was old, the hallway lights flickered, and the air conditioner rattled like it was fighting its final battle. She kicked off her shoes and dropped onto the couch with a tired sigh. A stack of unopened envelopes waited on the coffee table. Medical bills. Utility notices. Another reminder from the bank. Charlotte stared at them for a moment before looking away. Tomorrow would come soon enough. She did not need another reason to lose sleep tonight. Yet sleep refused to come anyway. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mason standing beneath the oak tree, completely calm while she lectured him about responsibility. Then she remembered his smile when she apologized. Most people do that. Judge the version of me they create in their heads. The words lingered in her thoughts. The next morning started before sunrise. Charlotte worked mornings at a local event company and spent afternoons helping her father manage paperwork for his struggling repair business. Since her mother's passing 3 years earlier, she had quietly become the person everyone depended on. She paid bills, solved problems, made sacrifices nobody noticed. By noon, she was answering client calls while eating a $10 sandwich at her desk. Across town, luxury hotels prepared for wine-seasoned tourists and private helicopters landed on vineyard estates. That world felt impossibly far away from hers. During her lunch break, her phone buzzed. It was her father. "Charlotte, I am sorry to ask again, but the insurance payment is due Friday." She closed her eyes briefly. "I know, Dad. I am working on it." "You have already done enough." "Not yet." After hanging up, she opened her banking app and studied the disappointing number on the screen. It was barely enough to cover her own rent. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine what life must be like for someone like Mason Whitmore. No overdue notices. No calculations at the grocery store. No choosing which bill could wait another month. Then she immediately felt guilty. The strange thing was that when she pictured him, she no longer thought about his money first. She remembered the kindness in his eyes when the bride thanked him. She remembered how he listened instead of showing off. The thought followed her through the rest of the day. That evening, as Charlotte prepared to leave work, her manager hurried into the office carrying a folder. "I need a volunteer for a charity planning meeting tomorrow," he said. "A major donor is funding a new community project, and they want local event coordinators involved." Charlotte accepted the folder without much interest. Then she glanced at the cover page. Her breath caught instantly. Printed beneath the project title was a familiar name: Mason Whitmore. Charlotte spent the entire drive to the meeting telling herself it was not a big deal. Napa was full of wealthy donors, successful entrepreneurs, and charitable foundations. There was no reason she should feel nervous about attending one more planning session. Yet the moment she walked into the conference center overlooking the valley, her confidence began to fade. The room was filled with polished professionals in tailored suits discussing budgets large enough to solve every problem currently sitting on her kitchen table. Charlotte quietly took a seat near the back and opened her notebook. She planned to stay invisible. That plan lasted less than 5 minutes. The doors opened and conversations immediately softened. Mason Whitmore entered the room. He wore a navy suit without a tie, looking professional yet approachable. Several executives stood to greet him. Others rushed over to shake his hand. Charlotte watched from her chair as he spoke to everyone with calm confidence. There was no arrogance. No need to impress anyone. Somehow that made him even more intimidating. Then, as if sensing her presence, Mason glanced across the room. Their eyes met instantly. For a brief second his expression shifted into surprise. Then came that familiar smile. Charlotte quickly looked down at her notebook. Wonderful. Now she was the woman who had accidentally insulted a billionaire, and could not stop running into him. The meeting began moments later. A presentation appeared on the large screen showing plans for a new community initiative designed to help working families afford important life events. Weddings, graduations, family celebrations. Opportunities that many people quietly gave up because they could not afford them. Charlotte listened carefully as project leaders explained the vision. The more she heard, the more impressed she became. This was not a publicity campaign. It was a genuine effort to help people who needed support. Near the end of the presentation, Mason stood and addressed the room. His voice was steady and sincere. Too many families miss important moments because of financial pressure. I believe memories should not belong only to people who can afford luxury. Several attendees nodded in agreement. Charlotte found herself doing the same. Then Mason asked a question. Does anyone here have direct experience working with families facing these challenges? Silence filled the room. Executives exchanged uncertain looks. Before Charlotte could stop herself, she raised her hand. Every head turned toward her. Her heart nearly stopped. Mason smiled encouragingly. Please. Charlotte swallowed hard. Then she spoke about the weddings she had coordinated for couples struggling to pay deposits. She described parents choosing between medical bills and graduation celebrations. She shared stories of ordinary people trying to create meaningful memories despite limited resources. The room listened carefully. When she finished, the silence felt different. Respectful. Thoughtful. Mason was still watching her. That perspective, he said quietly, is exactly why you are here. For the first time since entering the building, Charlotte forgot she was talking to a billionaire. She simply felt seen. And that feeling was far more powerful than she wanted to admit. The meeting ended an hour later, but Charlotte remained seated as attendees slowly filtered out of the room. Conversations echoed through the hallway while business cards changed hands and future partnerships began taking shape. She gathered her notes carefully, hoping to leave unnoticed. Unfortunately, fate appeared to have other plans. Charlotte. The familiar voice stopped her halfway to the door. She turned to find Mason approaching with the same calm confidence that seemed effortless for him. For a moment she considered pretending she had not heard him, but that would have been impossible. Hi, she said awkwardly. Hi. His smile was warm. Thank you for speaking up today. Charlotte shrugged. I was just answering the question. You were the only person in the room who actually answered it. That earned a reluctant laugh from her. Together they stepped into the hallway where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley. The late afternoon sunlight painted the vineyards gold, and for a brief moment the world felt unusually quiet. Mason glanced at the notebook tucked under her arm. You care about this project. Of course I do. Charlotte looked out the window. Most people think celebrations are luxuries. But they are not. They are memories. Families remember those moments forever. Mason nodded slowly. That is exactly why I started funding them. The sincerity in his voice caught her attention. She had expected someone in his position to talk about business strategies or charitable statistics. Instead, he sounded personal. Human. Why? She asked before she could stop herself. Mason was silent for a second. When I was younger, my family could not afford much. There were birthdays we skipped. Milestones that passed without celebration. I promised myself that if I ever had the resources, I would help other people keep those moments. Charlotte stared at him. That answer did not fit the billionaire image she had built in her head. Not even close. Before she could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, sighed softly, and slipped it back into his pocket. Problem? She asked. A faint smile appeared. Just work reminding me it exists. She laughed. I was wondering when the mysterious billionaire schedule would appear. Disappointed? A little. I expected at least 3 assistants and a private helicopter. Mason looked genuinely thoughtful. The helicopter is tomorrow. Charlotte froze. Mason held the serious expression for 2 full seconds before laughing. The sound surprised her. It was relaxed and unguarded, nothing like the polished businessman she saw in magazines. For the first time, she found herself laughing with him. As they walked toward the parking lot, Charlotte noticed something she had missed during the wedding. People greeted Mason everywhere. Security guards. Catering staff. Receptionists. He knew many of them by name. More surprising, they seemed genuinely happy to see him. Near the entrance, they finally stopped beside her aging sedan. Compared to the luxury vehicles surrounding them, it looked painfully out of place. Charlotte suddenly felt self-conscious. Mason did not seem to notice. There is another planning session next week, he said. I hope you will come. Charlotte met his eyes. Something about the invitation felt different from a business request. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a message from the bank. The payment deadline had been moved forward. Her stomach sank instantly. Reality had found her again. Charlotte drove home with the bank notification burning in the back of her mind. The amount was not impossible, but it was enough to keep her awake at night. By the time she reached her apartment, darkness had settled across Napa. She carried groceries up 2 flights of stairs, unlocked her door, and immediately noticed another envelope waiting on the floor. Her stomach tightened before she even picked it up. More paperwork. More numbers. More reminders that responsibility never seemed to take a day off. She set everything aside and called her father. He answered on the second ring. How was the meeting? He asked. Charlotte smiled despite her stress. Actually, it went really well. That sounds surprising. I know. Her father laughed softly. You deserve some good surprises. After hanging up, Charlotte sat quietly by the window. Outside, the city lights flickered against the hills. Her thoughts drifted back to Mason. Not because he was wealthy. Not because everyone seemed impressed by him. What stayed with her was the way he listened. Most people waited for their turn to speak. Mason paid attention. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The following week passed quickly. Work remained busy, bills remained stressful, and sleep remained optional. Yet through it all she found herself looking forward to the next project meeting. By Wednesday afternoon she arrived at the foundation office carrying a folder filled with ideas for community events. The building itself was elegant but surprisingly welcoming. Large windows filled the lobby with natural light, and photographs lined the walls showing families celebrating weddings, graduations, and anniversaries supported by the foundation. Charlotte paused in front of one image showing an elderly couple dancing beneath string lights. A small plaque beneath it read, "Every milestone deserves to be remembered." That one is my favorite too. She turned and found Mason standing beside her. You move quietly, she said. You were distracted. His eyes shifted toward the photograph. They had been married 40 years and never had a wedding reception. We helped organize one. Charlotte studied the picture again. The happiness on their faces was impossible to fake. You really care about this? Mason smiled. I do. Together they walked toward the conference room. During the meeting, Charlotte shared several proposals for affordable family celebrations. To her surprise, Mason supported nearly every suggestion. More importantly, he asked questions. Real questions. He treated her ideas as valuable instead of simply being polite. Afterward, most attendees left, but Mason remained behind organizing papers. Charlotte hesitated near the doorway. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Why do you trust me? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment he looked genuinely thoughtful. Then he answered. Because you say what you actually think. Charlotte laughed. That did not work out very well the first time we met. Mason grinned. Maybe not. But it was honest. Their eyes met for a second longer than either expected. Then Mason's assistant entered the room carrying a tablet. Her expression was professional, but something about the way she looked at Charlotte felt different. Curious. Evaluating. As if she had already heard stories. Charlotte suddenly realized that spending time with Mason Whitmore might be far more complicated than either of them expected. Charlotte tried not to think about the assistant's expression on the drive home, but it lingered in her mind longer than she wanted to admit. It was not rude. It was not unfriendly. It was simply the look of someone trying to figure out why a woman like Charlotte suddenly occupied space in Mason Whitmore's world. By Friday afternoon, the foundation team was preparing for the launch of its newest community program. Families from across Napa County would attend, and volunteers were everywhere carrying decorations, arranging tables, and organizing activities for children. Charlotte arrived early wearing jeans, comfortable sneakers, and a foundation volunteer badge. She immediately got to work. Unlike the executives who would appear later for speeches and photographs, Charlotte was happiest behind the scenes solving problems. A delivery arrived missing half its supplies. She fixed it. A volunteer coordinator called in sick. She covered the schedule. A family arrived nervous and confused about the event. She welcomed them personally. Hours passed before she realized someone had been watching her. Mason stood near the entrance speaking with donors, but every so often she caught him glancing in her direction. Not in a distracting way. More like he was quietly observing how she interacted with people. Late that afternoon, a little girl tugged on Charlotte's sleeve. Miss Charlotte, can you help me? The child held a crooked ribbon that had fallen from a display. Charlotte knelt beside her and carefully retied it. Perfect, she said. The girl smiled and ran off. You are good at that. Charlotte looked up and found Mason standing beside her. Tying ribbons? She asked. Making people feel comfortable. For a second neither spoke. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted across the lawn. Families gathered beneath white tents while children chased each other between picnic tables. It felt less like a charity event and more like a community celebration. Come with me, Mason said suddenly. Curious, Charlotte followed him toward a quieter section of the property. They stopped beside a wall covered with photographs from foundation projects over the years. Weddings, family reunions, scholarship ceremonies, military homecomings. Charlotte studied each image carefully. You funded all of these? She asked. Mason nodded. Not alone. A lot of people helped make them happen. Charlotte looked at him. Most billionaires buy islands. He laughed. I get seasick. She laughed too, then noticed a familiar photograph near the center of the display. It showed the wedding from a few weeks earlier. The same wedding where she had mistaken Mason for a runaway groom. There, pinned beside the picture, was a preserved white boutonniere. The flower he had picked up beneath the oak tree before the ceremony. Charlotte stared at it in surprise. You kept it? Mason followed her gaze. His smile softened. Some mistakes are worth remembering. For the first time, Charlotte felt her heartbeat quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with embarrassment. And somewhere deep inside, a realization began to form. She was no longer looking forward to these events because of the project. She was looking forward to seeing him. Over the next few weeks, Charlotte's routine began to change in ways she never expected. Her days were still filled with deadlines, invoices, and responsibilities, but now there were occasional messages from Mason asking for her opinion on foundation projects. Sometimes it was a question about an event. Sometimes it was a photograph from a completed community celebration. And sometimes it was simply a message asking if she had survived another long workday. To Charlotte's surprise, those small exchanges became the part of her day she looked forward to most. One Saturday morning, the foundation organized a volunteer trip to several community centers across Napa County. Charlotte arrived early and found Mason loading boxes into a delivery van alongside other volunteers. There were no cameras, no reporters, no public announcements. Just people working together. You know, there are probably easier ways for a billionaire to spend a Saturday, Charlotte teased as she picked up a box. Mason glanced at her. And miss all this excitement? She laughed. Carrying folding chairs is your definition of excitement? You would be surprised. Throughout the day they visited schools, community halls, and nonprofit organizations. Everywhere they went, people greeted Mason warmly. Not because of his money, Charlotte realized, but because he remembered names. He remembered stories. He remembered people. At one center, an elderly volunteer introduced Mason to her grandchildren. At another, a young couple thanked him for helping them afford their wedding the previous year. Charlotte watched each interaction carefully. None of them felt staged. None of them felt transactional. For the first time, she began to understand why so many people respected him. Later that afternoon, the volunteers stopped for lunch at a small family-owned diner. Charlotte and Mason ended up sharing a booth near the window. Sunlight streamed across the table as conversations buzzed around them. For a while they talked about ordinary things. Favorite movies. Childhood memories. Terrible first jobs. Then Mason asked a question that caught her off guard. What would you do if money was not a concern? Charlotte looked down at her coffee cup. Nobody had asked her that in years. Most people were too busy asking what needed fixing. I would start my own event company, she admitted quietly. Not luxury events. Community events. Weddings. Family celebrations. Things that bring people together. Mason smiled. That sounds exactly like something you should do. Charlotte shook her head. Maybe someday. She did not mention the bills waiting at home. She did not mention the bank notices or the pressure she carried every month. Mason seemed to sense there was more she was not saying, but he did not push. Instead, he simply said, Someday has a way of arriving faster than people expect. As they left the diner, Charlotte caught herself smiling for no reason at all. Then she noticed a black luxury car parked across the street. A stylish woman stepped out and froze the moment she saw Mason. The expression on her face changed instantly. Surprise. Recognition. And something far more complicated. Mason's smile disappeared the second he saw her. For a moment, nobody moved. The woman standing beside the luxury car looked elegant, confident, and completely out of place in the relaxed atmosphere of the community event. Her designer sunglasses rested on top of her head, and her tailored cream-colored outfit looked more suited for a corporate boardroom than a small-town diner. Charlotte noticed the immediate change in Mason's expression. It was subtle, but impossible to miss. The warmth that had filled his eyes moments earlier disappeared behind a carefully controlled calm. The woman walked toward them with a smile that seemed practiced. Mason, she said. It has been a while. Mason nodded politely. Victoria. Charlotte remained silent. She did not need an introduction to understand this was someone important. Victoria glanced toward her. And who is this? Before Mason could answer, Charlotte extended her hand. Charlotte Hayes. Victoria shook it briefly, her smile never changing. I have heard your name recently. Something about the comment immediately put Charlotte on edge. Hopefully good things, she replied. That depends on who is telling the story. Victoria's tone remained pleasant, but the words landed differently. Mason stepped forward slightly. Victoria, what brings you here? Business. She looked directly at him. And curiosity. Charlotte suddenly felt like she had walked into the middle of a conversation that started long before she arrived. After a few minutes of uncomfortable small talk, Victoria finally excused herself and headed toward a nearby meeting venue. The moment she disappeared from view, Charlotte turned toward Mason. Ex-girlfriend? She asked. Mason laughed softly. Was it that obvious? Only to everyone within 100 yards. He shook his head. Former fiancé. Charlotte nearly stopped walking. Former fiancé? Mason nodded. A long time ago. They continued toward the volunteer parking area, but something had shifted. Questions lingered between them. Charlotte wanted to ask more, yet part of her knew she should not. Later that evening, while cleaning up event supplies at home, her phone buzzed repeatedly. At first she ignored it. Then another notification appeared. And another. Confused, she opened a social media app. Her stomach dropped instantly. A photograph filled the screen. It showed her and Mason leaving the diner together earlier that day. The image itself was harmless. The comments beneath it were not. Some people assumed they were dating. Others accused Charlotte of chasing money. A few claimed she was using the foundation to get close to Mason. The rumors multiplied with every refresh. Charlotte stared at the screen in disbelief. She had done nothing wrong, yet strangers were already creating stories about her life. Her phone rang moments later. Mason's name appeared on the screen. She answered immediately. Have you seen it? He asked. Unfortunately, yes. Silence followed for a moment. Then Mason sighed. I am sorry. Charlotte looked out her apartment window into the darkness. Why are you apologizing? His answer came quietly. Because this is the part of my world I never wanted you to experience.